Welcome to this webinar on the importance of opposition leadership during COVID-19. I am Stephanie Snape and I will be leading you through the webinar. Over the last 20 years of my career, I've been privileged to almost exclusively work with local councillors on political leadership and political management. So let's start off by having a look at the format and approach of the webinars. So the LGA has produced 2 webinars on the role of the opposition. This first one looks at the importance of the opposition role and the roles that they can play during the emergency. The second one will look at what effective opposition looks like. The purpose is twofold. The first is stimulate debate on the importance of the contribution that opposition councillors can make. But the second is to support opposition groups in their work on COVID-19. The intended audience is opposition group leaders, deputy group leaders, opposition councillors, but also other members, senior officers, democratic service and member service officers. In terms of the format, each webinar is pre-recorded and comes with a separately downloadable PowerPoint presentation. In each, we will look at a range of issues, ideas, and frameworks. And included in both will be some self-reflection exercises to support your own learning and practice. And there is a call for information from opposition leaders and groups about how they've responded to COVID-19. Certainly it is the case that this emergency has brought to the forefront the issue of leadership. And effective leadership is so crucial in both managing and addressing the initial response and the later recovery phases. And there's a recognition that the public look to political leaders in particular for a number of things. They look for reassurance, they look for comfort, they look for a morale boost and a confidence boost. They want to see quick decisions promptly enacted, and they're looking for visible, excellent communication about what the public should do in response and what the government is going to do as well. The LGA has recently published a workbook for council leaders, elected mayors and cabinet members, which looks at their role during COVID-19. And in that publication, 7 key components of effective political leadership in control are identified. Some of those are about leading decisively, being flexible, working effectively with your teams, actively communicating and building both personal and team resilience. It might be as an opposition councillor, you find reviewing that workbook a useful exercise in order to understand the perspective of councillors in leading positions who are in controlling groups. But the purpose of these webinars is to really look at what's the role of opposition leaders, what's the role of opposition groups, what have they been doing in COVID-19, what could they do, what should they do. Now, if you start looking at opposition and opposition leadership during emergency situations, you pretty quickly come across a central dilemma which faces all opposition leaders. On one hand, do you adopt a cooperative, collaborative approach, almost a unified approach with controlling groups? But in doing that, You lose that clear blue water between yourself and the opposition, which in effect is what makes you an opposition. On the other hand, if you adopt a competitive, critical approach, you often can be cast as undermining public resolve, undermining morale, and playing politics during a crisis. What we can see currently is that central dilemma, that almost Hobson's choice for opposition's leaders, playing out across local government, playing out nationally at the national level, but also internationally. And if we cast a historical glance back over, say, 120 years of our nation's history, you'll see that whenever there's been a crisis or an emergency, there's an opposition leader considering what strategy should I adopt? And potentially also, when do I change to a different strategy? Now, this Hobson's choice, or this central dilemma for opposition leaders, is very much related to the opposition strategies that groups can adopt. And to look at those opposition strategies, we're going to use the opposition continuum. Now, the continuum is a way at looking how the relationship between controlling groups and opposition groups changes and is different from group to group. So in the continuum, there are 4 different major types of different relationship, from incorporation to collaboration to competition and then confrontation. Just going to explain this a bit further, and we're going to start on the left with incorporation. So in this situation, opposition and controlling groups would be very close partners. And if you asked a dispassionate outside observer, they probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the parties. It can be a very effective approach for opposition groups. They can achieve their goals through making political deals. Now we're going to move on and have a look at collaboration. In a collaborative situation, what you have is a tone and a style of working between opposition and ruling group or groups that is really very much about working in a cooperative manner so that they can agree on large and important key policies. And there would be other aspects where there is a disagreement, where the opposition would take a constructive opposition approach. Now, you'll sometimes see that those types of groups actually have a group value set, which is around the importance or laying a real emphasis on non-partisan working. We're going to move on again and have a look at competition. Now, opposition groups in this category, they're looking for that clear blue water between themselves and the controlling group. But competition isn't usually hostile or adversarial, but they will be producing their own policies, their own manifestos, alternative budgets. And they'll use a wide range of platforms in order to put across their opposition policies. What they wouldn't do, however, is use overview and scrutiny as an overtly opposition forum. And then last, we have confrontation. Now, in this situation, there is routine and often very vocal opposition to the controlling group decisions and policies. It can be hostile, it can be adversarial. All internal and external platforms would be used to pursue that opposition position. And they would also use scrutiny as another platform to be a vocal opposition. Now, it's a framework. And we have to be careful with frameworks. They can be really useful tools to help us gain insights, to think about forward plans, strategies, and actions. But it's very rare that an opposition group sits comfortably within one of these boxes. Indeed, the most politically savvy and astute opposition leaders will be working these different strategies in different contexts and with different people. But nevertheless, it's a useful tool. And I think it's a good place to just pause and to ask yourself 3 questions. In terms of your group's strategy, in the few years before COVID-19, what was it? How would you describe it? How would you characterize it? Does it fit closely to one of these 4 types? Secondly, how has your strategy been impacted by COVID-19? Have you been slightly shifted off equilibrium, or do you have a clear strategy? And then thirdly, what about going forward? What would your future strategy be as we go more and more potentially into recovery? So they certainly hopefully helps those different opposition strategies and thinking about your own positioning. And it's certainly the case that COVID-19 has had a marked impact on opposition groups across local government. Sometimes there have been silver linings, opportunities, but there are also restrictions and challenges. And I'm just going to mention a few. When you put emergency plans into place, you necessarily move to a different decision-making structure and processes. And by doing that, opposition then has to learn about how to adapt to those. In fact, across the councils in England, the council calendars have seen a lot of disruption. Council meetings, other meetings have been cancelled, and we're moving to virtual platforms. And again, disruption into the platforms that you have as an opposition, and moving and adapting to new platforms. And the officer-member relationship for opposition councillors is different. Not insignificant that 60 to 90% of local government officers are now working from home, and that will have an impact. But also, many authorities have put in place new procedures, for example, having a one email point of entry into officer side for members. All of that impacts on how the opposition works. What we've seen is real diversity in the initial experiences. So we have some opposition groups who are vocal and publicly vocal in some cases about feeling excluded from decision making and from engagement in the planning and operation processes. We also, on the other side, have some opposition groups who feel as though they've been appropriately included. This raises the issue of, overall, what roles do the opposition actually perform? So we're having a livelier debate, I think, increasingly, nationally and locally, about what is the role of the opposition. And often that's increasingly turning round to the fundamental debate about the nature of democracy, and a perception that opposition, effective opposition, is really necessary to have an effective, healthy, functioning democracy, including a local democracy. And so we're hearing more about the need for checks and balances. And checks and balances, in particular, the opposition has a very strong role to play as part of those checks and balances. So what we have is 2 slides. looking at the role of opposition. And it should be mentioned that these are specific to local government. They're not generic opposition roles. These are local government opposition roles. But what you'll see on the first page are roles very much around that check and balance argument. So we have providing challenging contestability to the development of policy, but also to its implementation. We have this role of asking probing, powerful questions of controlling groups. Also, the issue of holding ruling groups to account publicly, visibly. And that's not just the cabinet or the elected mayor or council leader. That might also be individual cabinet members when they have individual decision-making powers. The opposition role is always about monitoring effective implementation of policy, because there normally is some sort of a gap. And increasingly, one of the key arguments around having an effective opposition is that it can improve the governing party's policies and implementation. Now, the second slide, slightly different underpinning to these roles. So the first two are about going further than critiquing ruling party policies to proposing opposition alternative policies, budgets, proposing amendments to council policies. And then there are a few roles which are all to do with the representative role of opposition councillors and about advocating for opposition communities and for amplifying the voices that sometimes are not heard as well. Finally, always around scrutinising the impact of national government policy on local councils, particularly where the local scope to shape them is greater. And so the question, I think, again, that we should pause and say to ourselves, which of these are appropriate roles for the COVID-19 emergency? Which are inappropriate? Which are valid? Which are invalid? What do you think? What does your group think? Certainly, we would conclude that all of those roles are relevant, at least in theory. Some may be more difficult to do in practice. And some of them actually have almost a greater importance during times of emergency. I'm going to illustrate that with a few examples. When we move into emergency planning, we move into a greater concentration of decision-making power than is the situation in non-emergency context. Any further concentration of power, the argument goes, should be counterbalanced with a strong opposition role. Monitoring the implementation of policy is very important during emergencies, because you can have a greater mismatch between plans and actual delivery. So good questions for oppositions to ask are, what has happened we didn't expect would happen? Has that had a positive or a negative result? Actually asking powerful probing questions during an emergencies can be a very useful opposition strategy, because you're not pinning your flag on any particular mast. You're asking open probing questions and getting the answers on record. Now, given that a lot of councils have a marked local political geography, it's very important that opposition members are free to really advocate for their communities. In terms of our local patches, we know that there are few people better placed to understand their local communities than the local counsellor. So now we're going to move on and look at 2 reflection exercises. The first one is for a whole opposition group to undertake. So there are a number of questions there. How has your opposition group been impacted by COVID-19? How has your opposition group responded? What challenges has it faced? What opportunities are presented? What have you done with those? What resources are available? And what have you learned? And therefore could actually put into action in terms of forward strategies. Now, I know that opposition groups across the country are using virtual platforms to continue meeting. So please do use those questions if it's helpful in your group meetings to prompt a discussion. So there for the whole group. The next set are actually more personal for individual counsellors. So they start with, how has your role as an opposition leader, counsellor been impacted? How have you responded? What challenges have you faced? What opportunities have presented themselves? And what have you learned? So hopefully they will help you to learn about what experience you've had as a leader during COVID-19, to celebrate what's gone well and to think about what you'll do differently. So what I'd like to say now is thank you so much for listening. And please do join us for the second webinar looking at what effective opposition might look like. Please do download the PowerPoint that comes with this webinar. If you have time, we would really appreciate you filling in our call for information about what you're doing, some case studies, celebrate what's gone well, tell us what your challenges have been. And I'd like to finish by simply saying, please do take care and stay safe.